the 19th ward is usually a term that's used to cover the entire area of Southwest Rochester. But actually, if we're looking at the student population, there are two areas. One is the Plymouth Exchange neighborhood, which you've probably heard of. It's called the Plex neighborhood. And one is the 19th ward. The Plex neighborhood runs from the river to Genesee Street in general, and the 19th ward from Genesee Street to the airport. The first change in the neighborhood was the pedestrian footbridge, which I believe was 1993. That was really largely motivated by a U of R president, Dennis O'Brien. The problem with the footbridge, once it was built, is that it was referred to as a bridge to nowhere, because there wasn't anything of interest to students and to U of R faculty and staff immediately at the end of the footbridge. The development of the Brooks Landing area in the early part of the century, about 8 or 9 years ago, was really the first step. The hotel gave people a sense of movement, of economic movement, and of sort of increased welcome for the middle class. And then the extraordinary development of Riverview crossing the bridge, which was pretty controversial. There was a lot of, one thinks that there would be a lot of anxiety on the part of students and their families at the beginning when that was proposed, but there was an equal amount of anxiety on the part of the neighborhoods, because the neighborhoods were as worried about the difficulties that they might have with students as the students and their parents were worried about the difficulties they might have with their neighborhood. And that's a perspective that people don't often see. It's hard when you're cloistered or sequestered or whatever in your own group. It's hard to see what the other group is thinking or how the other group perceives your group. And I think that's probably a good way to begin talking about crime in the neighborhoods on the west side of the river. That how do people see each other? Yeah. Well, I never try to deny the fact that the communities are part of the city and that it's an urban environment. A lot of the students at the university, a lot of college students do not come from urban environments. They come from suburban environments. And I think that is part of the reason that anxiety is created. I never want to diminish the fact that crime exists, that whenever there's a population that has and a population that has less, there'll be some kind of imbalance that might express itself through crime. In a meeting a couple weeks ago, he said that there were, and again, you have to separate out a passive crime from an active crime. So there were two active sort of challenged robberies against students in the fall semester, I believe the period was. There are burglaries. I don't know exactly what to say about them other than they exist in all college environments, and they are notable in all college environments where the college is in an urban setting, and that's partly because of the inequity. There has to be some kind of reasonable detachment. One crime, one robbery, or even several burglaries does not create a chaotic atmosphere. That whenever there's a crime in the west side neighborhoods and it's directed against a student, if it's an active crime rather than a confrontational crime, a targeted crime, I should say, rather than a passive crime like a burglary. An email goes out to certain parts of the university population, and I never quite know which part, and that creates fear. I mean, it creates an alert. It's intended as an alert. One of the unintended consequences is fear. I wonder if crime against students was tracked in the same way in the neighborhoods where students spend their recreational time, what the statistics would look like. And I have to honestly wonder if every time there was a crime against a student on Parks, Meigs, Monroe, Alexander, East, University, what the perception of the West Side communities might be. A lot of the people, a lot of the residents of the West Side, quite honestly, have difficulty with the emails that only describe crimes against students on the West Side. If you emphasize something, then you give it greater importance, or then you give it the greatest importance. And if you don't address something, then you tend to minimize the fear and that would be attached to it. So that's a problem and a challenge that the West Side as a community is constantly struggling with. The perception versus the reality. Now, we do have, we're an urban neighborhood. We have violent crimes. We have homicides. I talked about targeted crimes. I would say, well, I'm sure there's an exception, but to my mind, almost without exception, the violent crimes are pretty much crimes committed by people who know someone. In other words, they're the assailant and the victim have some sort of relationship. So it's a problem that, it's a perception, problem perception. That's not entirely unmerited, but that's really overstated, and we struggle all the time with how to address it. Well, the 19 Board-and-Plex neighborhoods have always had students living there, and they've always had some administration and faculty living there. So there's always been, it's not as if there's a complete sea change. There's always been an element of U of R employee participation in the communities. But I think that when Riverview opened, I believe that within a year it became the most requested housing on campus. I don't know whether that's still true, but because the facilities were nice and modern, and that was a real impetus, I think, to building Brooks Crossing as well. So I think that it finally gave us, us being the community, a cohort of students who routinely lived in the neighborhood and were able to say, if not aggressively challenging the perception of a lot of students on campus and saying you're wrong, they at least probably challenge the perceptions by saying it's not as bad as you think, and maybe it's pretty nice, and maybe there's some really nice people who live there, or maybe I really like my neighbors. And so it's incremental. I think it's been an incremental exploration on the part of the student body. The biggest challenge is that undergraduates have a 4-year shelf life, and so there's constantly a new population being introduced, and there's constantly new anxieties. So the anxieties don't go away. You just have to keep readdressing them. A lot of the violent crime is drug trade based, and a lot of that ebbs and flows with the drug trade and the activity and the effectiveness of law enforcement on the drug trade. In terms of those crimes, in general, I don't know what the statistics on the decline of those crimes are, but yes, the murder rate citywide has gone down, and you generally look at it as as citywide. There is obviously a connection between poverty and homicide and violent crimes. There tend to be more violent crimes in poor neighborhoods. The passive crimes have also gone down dramatically in the last decade as well. I personally believe, and many people in the community believe, that the presence of the 19th Ward has one of the benefits of students moving into the neighborhood, that there's more awareness. There has been more awareness on the part of the Rochester Police Department of the neighborhood, and more concern to keep a stable neighborhood so that we don't have bad publicity. And so I think that an increased police presence, I think there's a community policing system in the city that's centered out of the Neighborhood Service Center and community police, or it's called Crime Prevention Officer, but actually it's community policing, in that the police are not assigned to the usual 911 call, the usual call for service. Instead, they go out to the community, and it's crime prevention rather than filing reports after a crime has been committed. That's been a very effective cohort to keep crime down in the city. And the student presence has definitely also. Another factor is that when the Plex area and the south part of the 19th Ward became hot places for students to live, a lot of the houses that had been HUD houses, which meant they were in foreclosure and up for auction by the federal government, then were bought by landlords who wanted to rent to U of R students. And so a lot of the abandoned houses and a lot of the distressed housing stock that we had in the neighborhood were rehabbed and renovated. And so we don't have as many, we have very few houses as a result that can attract crime, become drug houses. So it's been a real positive. So your generation, I will actually answer this personally. Your generation doesn't like suburbs. And there already is the beginning of what I think is going to be a huge migration back into cities. I think that in 10 years, if not a bit longer, we'll really start to see that migration from the suburbs to the cities really start to affect the income distribution and the education level of a lot of these communities, and that influx of your generation will raise all boats. And the biggest challenge that we have as a community and to prevent crime is really education. We have to get our schools in order to attract you, to attract your families to our neighborhoods. And we have to get our schools in order to give young people skills so that they can earn a living, so that they don't have to turn to crime.